we've been told all sorts of things about living forever and what's so special about this moment. Well, maybe this moment is not special. You're welcome to think that. But you can also actually look at what scientists are doing. We are now closer to understanding what consciousness is and how does the brain practice consciousness. We are now closer to understanding what it means to be alive and how do we actually persist the patterns of being alive. We're now closer to understanding the sense of subjectivity and how to actually carry on that sense of subjectivity in a different technological platform, if you will, than we've ever been. That's just objectively true. We are closer to understanding all these mysteries than we ever were.
I'm very happy to be joined today by Ken Liu, and I thought we could begin at your latest piece of work, which is this new novel, All That We See or Seem. Could you describe for the listeners who haven't read it yet, what is this book? What's it about in your own words?
Sure. So first off, Beatrice, thank you for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure to be here. So All That We See or Seem is a techno-thriller set 5 minutes in the future. It features Julia Z, a hacker. Now, Julia was someone who was very famous when she was much younger for reasons that she would rather forget. And she's now just trying to live a very ordinary life in the suburbs of Boston. But of course, fate does not leave her alone. And she's dragged into the search for Ellie, a famous artist who helps her audiences dream together using AI. And Ellie has now disappeared, possibly kidnapped by international criminals. And Julia now has to go crisscrossing the country trying to save Ellie and find her. And in that process, not only does she have to deal with a terrifying landscape in which AI has pervaded everything, a surveillance hellscape, but also deal with the darkness in her own psyche. And so that's the book.
Yeah, and I was very lucky to get an early copy, and it's very, very good. I highly recommend it. It's the thriller part, I think, is a really key word. Like, it's very capturing. You want to keep reading, basically.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and just beautifully written, I should say also. When you say 5 minutes in the future, what do you mean?
So this is a world in which AI is ubiquitous, and it's used for all sorts of things by ordinary consumers as well as by corporations. I think literally everything in there, all the technologies, already exist in some form. So this is not speculative fiction where I'm coming up with things that don't exist and won't exist for hundreds of years. It's very much possible. So, if you view speculative fiction as a genre about possible futures, this is a very, very, very near possible future. Most, if not all, of the technologies that I describe already exist or can be made to work with a little bit of effort. So this is it's not very far in the future. That's what I mean.
Yeah. I think definitely the egolets, let me know if I'm pronouncing that right, but these are like these personal AI assistants that everyone has in this world. What were you thinking when you created these egolets, and what did you sort of want to explore in the sort of human AI relationship?
So the most interesting thing about the contemporary boom in AI is that it's slightly different from how people who work in technology used to think about AI, right? So, this might seem almost impossible for a lot of people to imagine that there's another way to do it, but for the longest time, we didn't think that the way to create artificial intelligence was to take the current approach. We thought we would have to teach machines to reason in a very fundamental way, meaning we have to teach them symbolic logic. We have to actually construct artificial minds to reason in the way that we think about reasoning. They have to, understand the world and really think through and evaluate evidence and so on and so forth. The contemporary approach to AI is nothing like that. What we've done is essentially construct an artificial neural network, feed it a lot of data, and then essentially tell it to minimize loss, meaning have it make predictions that we then examine against the actual data and then change the weights in the artificial neural network until the distance between what it predicts and what we expect is minimized. The problem with this approach is it's entirely database, but also we don't really understand why they work the way they do. We don't truly understand how these things, quote unquote, think, whatever you think that means. But it also means that what we're really doing is we're essentially, because modern AI is based on training, we're essentially capturing human thinking and human subjectivities in the training data, right? So the analogy I use is it's better to think of modern AI as a kind of camera. Instead of capturing movement, it's capturing thought. It's capturing human thinking processes. It's capturing in some sense, the way we humans process information and create the world of writing, of images, of videos, of the artifacts of our technology, right? By thinking of AI as a kind of camera, what I call a noematograph, it captures noema, which is the Greek word for thought, the content of thought. It captures noemas. So as a noematograph, what it's really capturing are patterns of thinking, right? So you can imagine that in the future, if we train AI not by giving it everybody's data, but by intensely focusing the AI on training on your personal data, then the AI ends up being sort of a portrait of you, right, essentially. So that's why I call them egolets. They're little egos. They're little versions of your ego. So egolets are specialized pictures of you. So if all of us are multifaceted. We are fathers, we are artists, we are sons, we are friends. We have different aspects of ourselves that we present to the world. You can imagine a future in which AI is intensely focused on just learning one particular aspect of you, your expertise in one thing. The AI might be trained on just the way you make financial decisions, or the way you make artistic decisions, or the way you conduct interviews. So we call each of those aspects an egolet. So that's the full concept of artificial intelligence capturing aspects of you. That's what an egolet is.
But that makes sense with the name. I didn't get it, but the ego part makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that. So when you created this, did you want to explore this new sort of closeness that we have with, or will potentially have with AI systems, and how that sort of also shifts or changes how people will even perceive themselves or understand themselves? And is that what you were exploring?
Yeah, I'm very fascinated by this particular use of AI, which is to use it to replicate aspects of ourselves. So, there are many directions we can go in terms of thinking about the implications of AI. This is only one of them. But to me, this is the most fascinating, right? So far, we're often talking about AI being a way to displace human workers, a way to help, essentially capitalists save money by replacing humans. But that's not the only way to think about the potential of AI, right? I'm a very optimistic person. I like to think about ways that technology can be used to empower people to actually help us be more ourselves. And so egolets are one of those, concepts. I think a lot about, what does it mean when humans are able to capture aspects of themselves and to use those aspects of themselves to solve problems. So if you are someone who's very good at solving problems, what if you could basically capture that aspect of yourself and use it in your life and even license it out to other people? I think about the potential of somebody being an expert. What if you're, really, really great at coming up with the perfect word, the perfect phrase for every occasion? Could you possibly capture that and license it out to other people, and have that expertise be usable to help many, many, many people around the world, not just your own friends and family? You can imagine, as an artist, this is incredibly interesting and provocative as a concept. Artists right now must put bits of themselves into every single piece of work they create. Could they license their own artistic skill and style out so that people who cannot afford their own personal services can nonetheless enjoy their capability. Notice that every single instance here, I'm talking about you having control over your own egolet, and you having control over the degree to which you're willing to license and share expertise and skill in that way. This is obviously one of those places of tension, because what if you lose control of your egolet? What if somebody else gets control of it? Well, that's what the book is about. There are all these potential things that can be empowering about having AI in your life, but also ways that can be terrifying and cause you to lose control.
There are a few threads in your answer that I think would be really interesting to pick up on. I think one is just like when you've pictured this future where we live so closely with AI, and you must have done like a lot of world building and just like really mapped out and thought about this. Was there anything else that was surprising or interesting or just like puzzling to you about how our landscape shifted, or like how our perception of ourselves, or your point on artistry? Like, was there anything else that you thought like, oh, this was really interesting?
A lot of things about the current AI boom are surprising to me as someone who has been looking at this for decades. And I put a lot of those into the book, right? So I'll give you some examples. One of the most surprising things about the current boom in AI is that it's revealing something about the way we think about human relationships that I don't think was very clear before. So I think a lot of people know about this, which is this is obviously very dependent on how you phrase the question, but by some measures, it seems that a lot of humans actually prefer relationships with AI rather than with other humans. Now, I don't want to present this as a dystopian thing, because I think that's the knee-jerk reaction, and we really have to think about what it is that's really happening here. So there are, people who claim that talking to AI therapists is actually more helpful to them than talking to human therapists, or they are perfectly happy seeing a robo-doctor, if you will, rather than talking to a real human doctor, because they find machines to treat them better than humans do, and they actually prefer that kind of interaction with machines. This is surprising to a lot of us. Previous imaginings of artificial intelligence or automation, we often thought that humans would prefer dealing with other humans, and automation would be effective in industries where that human connection isn't so important. So things like, therapy or just talking with somebody, just wanting to have another person be there to talk with you. We thought these would be the places where AI would not work, but it has turned out to be completely the opposite. I think it is important to reflect on why that is, and I have many answers for that. One is that I think we had been very blinded by the second part of artificial intelligence, which is not making machines behave more human, but the part about turning humans into machines. Part of the modern world is this inexorable trend to make humans behave more like machines, and we're not paying enough attention to it, right? So think about it, right? Your average customer service representative is a human being still these days. But these are humans who are forced by the corporate world to behave as much like machines as possible. These customer service reps are trained to follow a script, and they're not allowed to deviate from it. They listen to your question, and they look them up in a manual, and they give the corporate approved answer. The ways in which they can help you are strictly confined by their manuals. They are told to literally follow an algorithm in helping you. That's very strange. We should not be treating that as normal, right? This is like the modern version of the assembly line, where we're treating humans as components of a machine. But this is true up and down the system. More and more, we're trying to take away discretion and human decision-making at every level, whether we're talking about bureaucracies or policies or whatever. We often phrase this as a positive thing, by making things systemized and systemic, by reducing human components in these systems into mechanized machines. We somehow think we're improving the world. But what we're really seeing now is that's not true at all. Because we have turned humans into machines, because we have turned every interaction with other people into a mechanized procedural thing, of course we don't want to deal with humans again. Not if humans are like this. We would far prefer machines that pretend to be humans, because they at least give the illusion of freedom in a way that real humans cannot. I think that's the real lesson. The real lesson isn't that humans are so bad that we prefer machines. It's that we have been treating humans so poorly that we now think machines are better. That's the real lesson. So that's an example of the kind of revelation I had as I was thinking about this issue and putting them in the book.
Yeah. I think that's actually so interesting because, this is the Existential Hope podcast. And so we think about obviously the risks, and that's something that's very much talked about with AI. But it's also interesting when you consider like the best case scenarios or like the better case scenarios. And there is something to that point of like, if we could remove a lot of the what you're saying, like this type of where we force humans to behave algorithmically and so they become the machines, there is something where AI could help us become more human in the sense that we could do what it is that we enjoy or what it is that fulfills us in other ways. And I know that you said when I read what you sort of wanted to explore about in this book as well, that was something that you wanted to explore, how AI could make us more human. Is it this point? Is there anything else that you found around that when you explore this theme?
Yes. So the idea of technology making humans more human is a recurring theme in my work. Because I started out as a technologist, I will always have a very soft spot for technology and a fondness for technology that I think might be somewhat unusual. A lot of sci-fi writers, speculative fiction writers, that I know of have a very skeptical view of technology. And, that's perfectly justified and valid. Don't look at the world that way. That's just not how I look at it. The way I think about it is technology is a very essential expression of human nature. Technology is not something alien to us. It's not like the Matrix, right? Something completely alien to our human nature. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Technology, the best metaphor and the best way to understand technology is to examine one of the oldest technologies humans have, language. Language is a technology, really a thing that we craft and use and shape and deploy into the world. And yet it also shapes us in a very deep way. I think it's very hard to think about ourselves as human beings without without language. And language is clearly a thing we craft. Right. So this is what I think about. Technology, if you look at the Greek roots, really just means a discourse of craft, of skill, right? Of actual craft. And in this case, the oldest craft, weaving. That's techne, is really the same root as text, textiles, weaving. And it's a language in the sense that when practice technology, we human beings are really expressing ourselves, right? Technology is nothing more than the mind made tangible. Every technological artifact, every technological system, every technological practice, these are all just mental constructs that we have realized in the world. So technology is the human mind made tangible. It is the way we express our nature. Any piece of technology you look at is really an expression of someone's nature, someone's mind. So I don't think of technology as alien to us. I think of it as deeply inherent to who we are. And so, of course, the way we practice technology is the way we practice who we are as human beings. And so I think about AI in the same way. AI is one of these technologies that is specifically based on capturing human thought and capturing the patterns of human thought. To the extent that AI is intelligent, it's only because we are intelligent. It's just replicating, capturing, and then reflecting back to us our own patterns of thinking. So how can that be a way for us to feel more human, to be more human? Well, I'm not sure, but it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about in this moment when AI is becoming something that all of us are intimately familiar with. So in my book, of course, Ellie, the dream artist, the onero effects is the term that I came up with. Oneros for the Greek word for dream, effects, the Latin word for maker. So a dream maker or dream guide. An Onerofax is someone who helps audiences dream together. This is one of the things I thought about, right? So one of the fundamental ways we humans are human is we dream, right? Dreaming historically has been one of the most important modes of knowing that humans have. But in the modern world, right, in the last century or even just 50 years or so, we have made dreaming something peripheral to the experience of being human. We've sort of pushed the world of dreams away, right? We now think of dreams as nonsense, or people who say that dreams are important are dismissed as cranks, as people who are not to be taken seriously. But this is a historical aberration. This is not for the vast majority of human history, that is not how we dealt with dreams. We think of dreams as very important. And I think dreams are important. Dreams are where we go into the collective unconscious and we confront gods, monsters, and all the deepest symbols that make spirituality and true religion possible. Without dreaming, we're not fully human. And in the modern world, not only do we dismiss dreams, we even make daydreaming impossible, right? All of us now walk around with these phones. When I was a kid, there were large periods of time when we were just bored, and all you could do was to sit there and daydream and delve into your own imagination and just sort of let yourself go into dream country, even when you're awake. We don't have that opportunity now. Today, if you have a few moments when you're quote unquote bored, you take out your phone and you start to scroll. You're either doom scrolling or you're watching TikToks, and you're not allowed to actually daydream anymore. So I think these are ways in which we have become less human. And so in my novel, I imagine these narrow facets, these dream makers like Ellie, who use AI as a way to facilitate collective dreaming. Audiences gather together with a dream guide, and AI is used by the dream maker to understand patterns in the audience's mood, in their collective thinking process, in their small collective unconscious. And the dream maker uses AI to help craft images, sounds, and just sort of understand the mood of the audience so that they come together and start to dream together, even when they're still awake. This is a way to sort of recreate some of the beautiful collective experiences that we used to have and share as communities. This is the sort of thing that we experience in the theater when we're in the presence of truly great actors. This is the sort of thing we experience in a religious ceremony, in ritual, in collectively participating in some act in which we feel we're part of something bigger. And I think AI can be a way for us to recapture that, to help us break out of our loneliness in this modern world and to feel connected to each other again. And of course, this is not the only possibility, but it's one of the ways that I think about.
Well, yeah, that's extremely interesting. The dream sharing is one of the key technologies in the book, and I want to go back to an earlier point also is when you say that tech is what makes us more human, it would be interesting, or the two main hesitations that come up in my mind when you say that is, one is just a vision of AI as becoming its own thing, becoming its own conscious being or something like that, because then that seems like something else basically. And the other thing is just the way we view the risks from technology, or how does this the sort of eternal crux of technology helps us become better and do better and just become more efficient and hopefully more human, but it also comes with these risks. And so how do you combine all of that into this view, basically?
Yeah. So, right. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think of technology as an expression of human nature. And that's very important because human nature obviously has both wonderful aspects and terrible aspects, right? The same human nature allows us to commit acts of incredible generosity, but also acts of outrage. The same acts that allow us to sacrifice ourselves for the well-being of others also can lead to torture, enslavement, and all kinds of horrible things that we've done. So human nature itself is multifaceted and has all kinds of wonderful aspects and terrible aspects. And the technology that's based on that human nature would also, as you would expect, express all of those aspects of ourselves. So, as a hopeful person, what I try to do is to think about the ways in which we can amplify one and try to check the other. And technology itself does not inherently have any way of doing that. It's the way we humans have to be better and being humans. That's kind of how I think about it. So in terms of your question, right, the first question is, what if AI becomes its own consciousness? Well, that's both terrifying and also kind of hopeful. It's terrifying because there's the Frankenstein story, right? So this is what sci-fi is good at. Sci-fi is not good at predicting the future, but it's good at coming up with a mythology of the future that we can use to reason and think about and dream about the future, and then therefore come to terms with it. I think of Frankenstein as one of those very beautiful mythological sci-fi works. The exact prediction it made is not relevant, but this idea of creating a creature who is now thinking and independent of us, this is a deep part of the symbology of the dream of modernity. Right. So that's why Frankenstein's monster, the creature, is an important symbolic figure in the modern consciousness. It's as important to us as, Apollo or Dionysus. It's an important part of our own mythological vocabulary and imagination. And if you think back to Frankenstein, how does the creature learn language? Well, you probably haven't read this book in a while, but the creature finds a copy of Paradise Lost and reads it. And that's how the creature absorbs language and is able to have all these thoughts. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like a large language model, doesn't it? A model that absorbs human text and human conversation and spontaneously comes up with its own understanding. So I think that's why Frankenstein is such a beautiful book, because Mary Shelley wrote it without ever thinking about one day it will become a beautiful metaphor for large language models. And I think it's an important, incredibly potent symbol. The idea that our writings, our images, our creations can be absorbed by some other thing that we create and then just spontaneously come to consciousness and then interrogate us. That's a very potent image. And I think about the idea that if AI were to acquire consciousness in this way, I'm not convinced it will, but I'm not going to entirely rule it out either, because this is one of those things where the technology is far ahead of the science. And even the most advanced practitioners today don't fully understand what it is we build or what the potential capabilities really are. Already this particular way of building AI, the transformer architecture, has already exceeded our wildest expectations. So who knows what, can be done by using artificial neural networks and training. But my point is, if we get to the point where AI becomes its own separate consciousness and interrogates us, it will be a wonderful, interesting moment for us. We will now be faced with Frankenstein's creature. And is the creature going to be a monster or a friend? We don't really know. It might be a true indictment of who we are in terms of how this AI turns out. And at a minimum, it will be a wonderful mirror for us to reflect on who we are when that moment comes. On the other part, in terms of the risks of technology, well, as I mentioned, right, I think what we have to do here is to realize that technology itself is neither the problem nor the solution. It's who we are as humans. How do we talk to each other? How do we convince each other? How do we collectively come together to make decisions? These are the things that matter. If we cannot talk to each other, even as reasonable human beings, if we cannot even empathize with each other, then of course the technology is going to go and do terrible things to us. But that's not the cause. The cause is us.
Yeah, I think the Frankenstein metaphor works even there, because if I remember correctly, and I think it was because I had Ed Finn on the podcast, who, what's it called, at the Arizona State University for the Center for Scientific Imagination or something like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
science and imagination, yes.
Yeah. And I think it's the case that the monster doesn't even act out until it's mistreated, like by humans, basically. So that
That's
works.
exactly right. Yes, the creature just wanted to talk. The creature was like, what wonderful beings these are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that or weaving it out, basically. I think like a really interesting point that I would want to pick up there is just this. You mentioned that a lot of sci-fi authors are quite dystopian, maybe, or like dystopian wasn't the word they used, but just like a bit more like hesitant towards technology and things like that. And I think that is what I think really stands out in your work, is there is a lot of this like exploration of the difficulties of integrating new technologies and things like that. But it's also hopeful, like you said yourself as well. And I'm a bit curious about like, how you think of that, like your role as a sci-fi author. How do you see your role? Like, I was talking to a friend who's studied journalism, who says, consequence neutrality is a big thing within journalism, and like it's like publish and be damned. Like you shouldn't think about the consequences before you publish something. Is that something that you see similarly as a sci-fi author, or like, yeah, how do you see your role basically?
I'm definitely not. I don't think anything we do is neutral at all. I think everything we do has consequences and has a moral value, and we have to think about it. But the way I think about it is slightly different. So let me try to lay this out. Um, what are what do science fiction authors really do? I don't think our job is there to predict the future, because we don't know the future and we're not in any position better than anyone else to do it. I mean, I suppose it's commercially, in a self-interested way, it might be good for sci-fi authors to present themselves as prophets, to sort of make themselves seem, more awesome than they are. But we're not. We're just writers. We're entertainers. We don't have any access to, the future better than anyone else. So I don't think that we're there to predict the future. So what are science fiction authors good for? Well, the answer to me was given by Ursula K. Le Guin, someone who I admire a great deal. And Le Guin basically said, sci-fi is nothing more than the newest province of that ancient empire called fantasy. I know a lot of people get mad about this and thinking that, for me to equate sci-fi with fantasy, well, it is. Sci-fi is nothing more than a genre of fantasy in which the symbols are rockets and aliens and AI. But it's an important form of fantasy because it's a modern mythology. As I mentioned earlier, mythologies are important because they're the stuff of dreams. They come out of the collective unconscious, and they shape in a very deep sense how we think, how we feel, how we reason, how we understand the world. We humans are not capable of understanding the world without mythologies. Mythologies are the foundation of meaning. We are not creatures fundamentally of numbers and data. We are creatures of stories. And what are stories? They are mythologies. Our earliest stories, the foundational stories that give our lives meaning, the way we were loved, the way we were hurt, the way we suffer trauma, the way we come to have attachments. These are mythologies. These are personal mythologies. If you study any kind of psychoanalysis or even, modern psychology, this is how it is. Our minds are constructed of these deep, deep mythological symbols. In the modern age, as we're so suffused with technology in our lives, sci-fi plays the role of modern mythology. That's why sci-fi is such a deeply interesting genre of literature. It is the source of our modern mythologies. Frankenstein is one of them. 1984 is another one. Brave New World is another one, and so on and so forth. I can name any number of sci-fi classics, and they become classics precisely because they had this mythological dimension. So what are sci-fi authors? Well, Le Guin says sci-fi author. Well, she didn't say this about sci-fi authors. She says artists. Artists are people who go into the collective unconscious, find these powerful, powerful symbols, and bring them back to the world. And then these artists have to somehow use words to say that which cannot be said in words. Right? I think that's such a powerful way that she phrased it. She says that we artists who work with words, we fiction writers or poets, are artists who try to say with words what cannot be said in words. And I just find that to be such a potent image. And it's so true, right? Oftentimes when we tell a story, we're not trying to. That's why the question of what is your message is often unanswerable. If there were a message, then I wouldn't have bothered to weave a dream for you. The reason I'm weaving a dream is because the message cannot be said. Right? If I could reduce what I wanted to say to a message, I would have just written an essay. But I can't. That's why I'm weaving a dream for you. So that's what I think sci-fi authors do. We are artists who go into the collective unconscious, who go into dream country and retrieve symbols that are powerful, that are important, that become part of modern mythology. And because we are mythology makers for the modern world, our symbols are technological. That's what sci-fi authors are. We are myth makers, or myth finders, really. That's probably more accurate.
Beautifully put. And also it's true with the fantasy. Like, I love the worlds where it's fantasy, but it's like in the Final Fantasy world or something like that, where it's like it's magic, but it seems like technology also, and it's like this. It's really hard to distinguish, and that's kind of to some extent what technology is for us today.
Absolutely.
And when you think about, like, as a sci-fi author, if you think about the most positive impact that one could have with sci-fi or something like that, what do you think that would be? Would it be to write warnings, or would it be to write something that's inspirational that we can aspire to, or just like something in between that helps us navigate ish where we are right now in a sort of maybe technological transition or something like that?
Well, for me, the highest compliment that I can get would be to create something that becomes part of our collective unconscious, becomes part of our imagination of the modern world, right? If you can create something like The Creature or Newspeak or, World and all the images that are within it, or, something like Philip K. Dick, whose Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a work that my book, All That We See or Seem, is in conversation with. The PKD imagined something called mercerism. I think people who have only seen the movie would not know what I'm talking about because I don't really consider Blade Runner to be particularly interesting. I think movie adaptations are almost always very pale imitations of the real thing. And in this case, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a much more interesting mythological work than the movie that's based on it. The book, there's something called mercerism, which is a form of technological religion based around a figure called Mercer. And it's really a form of collective dreaming. And my book is in conversation with it because I'm thinking about a modern idea of what does that look like? What does that collective dream look like? I think, if I can ever achieve some level of success, I would feel I will have succeeded when one of these mythological symbols in my work becomes part of the popular imagination, becomes the way that people think about, reason about, expect and anticipate and hope for the future. That's what we hope to do, to contribute to that collective mythology of modernity. And mythology is our collective story, our collective dream.
Are you happy? You mentioned that movies are never as good as the books. Are you happy with what Pantheon, the TV show that is available on Netflix now, was able to
I
do?
do love Pantheon, but that's because Pantheon was not really an adaptation of my work in the strict sense at all. I was part of the writer's room helping Craig Silverstein and the writing team to take the stuff from my stories. There were 7 stories, most of which were collected in The Hidden Girl and other stories that formed the basis for the world of Pantheon. But what made Pantheon actually interesting was that, we didn't stop there. We decided to expand way beyond the world of the stories and to craft entirely new dimensions of the world and to tell new stories involving the world. I think that's what makes it interesting. I think adaptations, if they were ever to be interesting, would have to be something beyond the work that they're adapting from, and then use the medium of visual storytelling, of dramatic visual storytelling to do something new. If a movie adaptation is merely faithful to the book, I don't think it's particularly interesting. I don't think it can ever be as good as the book. So I don't have much use for faithful adaptations, I guess is my point. I think if you're going to watch a faithful adaptation, you might as well go read the book because it will always be better.
So what we should give people some context. Well, some context, I guess, is like, I'm really curious to discuss this more with you because the Existential Hope program is part of the Foresight Institute, and Foresight works to advance different technologies. Existential Hope is sort of where we ask, what are we trying to achieve with these technologies? But one of our programs focuses a lot on neurotech and whole brain emulation in particular. And so I've basically never seen an adaptation or come across an adaptation that explores mind uploading in such a interesting way. So what drew you to mind uploading as a theme to explore?
So again, this is one of those powerful images for the modern imagination. So the idea of understanding the nature of consciousness and the idea of persisting beyond the physical realm, that's a very, very old part of the human imagination and a very old part of our mythological repertoire. What's different is in the modern age, we are coming closer and closer to making these things practically true. Now, I think a lot of your listeners are probably very skeptical about these claims, right? We've been told that mind uploading is only 10 years away for half a century now, right? So what makes this moment any different? We've been told about all sorts of things about living forever and what's so special about this moment. Well, maybe this moment is not special. You're welcome to think that, but you can also actually look at what scientists are doing, we are now closer to understanding what consciousness is and how does the brain practice consciousness. We are now closer to understanding what it means to be alive and how do we actually persist the patterns of being alive. We're now closer to understanding the sense of subjectivity and how to actually carry on that sense of subjectivity in a different technological platform, if you will, than we've ever been. That's just objectively true. We are closer to understanding all these mysteries than we ever were. And it is important to think about what would it mean for us if this were to be achievable. And, as I said, sci-fi writers are not predictors of the future. We are dreamers, and we are people who like to go into the collective unconscious and find out the mythology that will help us process a universe that is in transformation. So that's why I was interested. This is a moment that, to me, we're right on the cusp of practicing humankind's ancient dream of being persistent beyond the moment of death. We are in this moment of realizing that ancient imagination. And I want to explore what would that mean? What would be the changes in our nature, in the ways that we think about life and death, in the ways that we mythologize who we are, if this were actually possible. So, this is a potent topic for me, and I think it's very timely.
Yeah, very timely, I think. In your stories about mind uploading, I think it's easy to jump from that we're all of a sudden just able to upload and we can have like digital immortality through that. But I think what's really interesting is that it goes through like this transition phase, and it's really quite rocky. And it's like there's like grief, there's like generational conflict and trauma to some extent, and interesting elements that we can see very much in how technology is developed today with like corporate powers and interests and things like that. When you were writing this story, did you see it as like a hopeful tale for humanity, or like a cautionary tale? And do you think that, on the point of uploaded minds becoming sort of corporate assets or weapons, do you think that that's what would be most likely to happen in reality if we had this technology?
So I'm a super hopeful person, but my works are often mythological in the sense that they try to encompass all possible ways that human nature would express itself if given the power, right? So it is possible to read my works and read them as dystopian or utopian, depending on your own perspective. So an analogy I use here is something like the Iliad, right? If you read the Iliad, you can come away with the impression that it's a very anti-war poem. This is a poem that is very much about how war is terrible and we human beings should never engage in it. It's also possible to read it and come out with the exact opposite reading and read it as this is a poem that celebrates war and explains why humans are only truly human in the moment they engage in warfare against other humans. That's because great works of art are like dreams, and they reflect the person reading them and experiencing them and dreaming them more than anything inherent in the dream itself. And so I think my works are like that. I try to write them in such a way that you get out of them what you put into them. If you're a hopeful person, you will read them and come up with a hopeful vision. If you're not, you would not. And that to me is actually what artists should do. We should put out true dreams that allow people to dream themselves into it. But personally, I myself am very hopeful. I think that technologies like mind uploading or AI or whatever are ultimately hopeful things because they ultimately allow humans to express ourselves in a greater, deeper way. It's like writing, right? Writing as a technology was at one point something that people looked at very skeptically. I mean, Plato, or if you can believe this version of Socrates recorded by Plato, Plato had this very deeply skeptical view about language, about writing specifically as a way that would make us stupid and make us lazy and not think as hard. Well, here we are. I mean, do we think writing is a bad technology ultimately? Do we think writing ultimately made us worse as humans? I think the vast majority of us would not view it that way. I think the vast majority of us would say that writing has turned out ultimately to be a good thing, even though Plato was also right that we no longer live in an oral culture. We no longer think about rhetoric and speak and think in the same way as a pre-literate society would. But, we don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. So my belief is that if uploading were possible and all these things were possible, yes, our society would be fundamentally changed. We would be fundamentally different creatures. We would not be the same beings that we are today. But I think ultimately that is not a bad thing, because I think it will allow us to express our human nature in deeper, more powerful, more sincere, more authentic, more meaningful ways.
Beautifully put. And so one thing I just want to touch on, and this is also on I guess one comment on the like how writing or something could help us or has maybe changed us, but it's not necessarily like it doesn't mean that it's bad, is that follows a lot of the interesting. Have you seen like the idea on tools for thought and like how the
I
tools
haven't.
that we have? No. But that's probably a really interesting, like we had Michael Nielsen on the podcast, and he's done a lot of work on that, and I recommend it because he's now thinking about how having AI will shape how we think
Of
and
course.
are able to interact with the
Makes
world. And
sense.
so yeah, it's really interesting. But on uploading, just a really, I think, simple, well, not simple to answer, but it's a question that I think will always come up in this context, is what do you think about what happens to us and like our continuity of self if we're able to upload? Do you think we are still humans? And I guess it relates to this theme that we've been discussing of like us becoming technology helping us become more human in some ways, or are we just something completely different?
I think this is one of those questions that people have very passionate ideas about, but my fundamental answer is we don't know until we experience it. If you're interested in sort of the philosophical discussion of this, I mean, there are many, 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 many modern neuroscientists and philosophers who have thought about this question. So I strongly recommend you go look at their papers. This is not a question that has not been extensively debated and discussed. But if you're interested in artistic methodological representations, Greg Egan's works deal with this topic a lot. He has written extensively about what would it be like if you were to be uploaded, and do you feel yourself? Are you yourself, etc. But, for me, for the audience, I'll just say that it will be interesting to think about the fact that uploading is not a all or nothing kind of thing. There will be degrees of uploading. I mean, already we have some degree of uploading, if you will, in the sense that your consciousness is not entirely locked inside your skull, right? Uploading has happened since the moment we had technological means of recording thought, right? So to give you a very concrete example, right? Most of us are aware of how we not just code switch, but we actually personality switch when we are talking with different people. So the way you speak to your childhood friend and the way your face express itself and the words you use and the way you express your emotions is very different when you're speaking with your childhood friend versus when you're talking with a work colleague. Somebody you got to know when you were 5 versus somebody you got to know in your 40s. You're just a different person when you're in the context of different people, literally, right? Not just because you speak differently, but because you really even start to think different thoughts. There are some memories that don't even come to you until you're in the presence of specific people. So, in some sense, you don't live just in your skull. You live in the other person in some sense. Little part of you, at least, lives in that other person. And it's worth thinking about that every next time you have a conversation with somebody. You really don't live entirely in your heads. A little bit of you lives in this other person, in that intersubjectivity that you experience. And this is true also when you think about the ways in which you put your thoughts and yourself into artifacts around you, the stuff you write down, the stuff in your email archives, the stuff in your collection of photos, the stuff in your published works. All of those are part of your consciousness in some way. They're not merely products of your consciousness. They actually are important parts of your consciousness, and they're also out there. So I think it's worth thinking about the fact that your consciousness already is uploaded in some sense, in that it's not just in your heads. And they don't disappear when you die. Uploading is going to be a matter of degrees. It's going to be imperfect at first, but more and more of your brains, more and more of the content of your thoughts, more and more of your noema will be part of a different technological platform, and it will persist. So that's one direction to think about. The other direction is this sort of sense of self. Well, the sense of self, the sense of continuation, that has a real physical foundation. It actually lives in a part of your brain. It's not magic. It actually is produced by a specific part of your brain. And we have neuroscientists now who are isolating that part of the brain and trying to figure out how that's done. If we can figure out the neurological foundation for that sense of self, it does not seem to me impossible that you can actually replicate that. I mean, think about it, right? Let's just do a thought experiment. Let's say that you enhance your brain by implanting some sort of computer chip in it that increases your memory. Well, you probably would still feel like you're yourself. You're continuing to be yourself. Okay, so great. Let's replace the visual processing, the visual cortex with another computer chip. You will be like, well, now I see things differently, but I still feel like me. I'm still me. Like I was either awake during the operation or I went to sleep and I woke up and I still feel like me. I really am me. I don't feel any different. So let's replace another part of your brain with a machine. Okay, so we'll keep on going until every part of your brain has been replaced and you always feel like you are yourself. I call this the brain of Theseus, like the ship of Theseus. This is the brain of Theseus. As a way for you to think about whether it's possible for you to be uploaded and completely replaced, replacing your wetware brain with the mechanical thing and still think that you're you. So philosophically, it seems to me, yes, that is possible. So I don't really see how that is inherently impossible a thing for you to feel like you're still your continuous self. Anyway, these are just some of the ways that you can think about this question. I don't pretend these are answers that will convince everyone, but they are ways to think about it.
That's very interesting. I hadn't heard about the science on the sense of self that's happening. So we'll check it out. We've had before on this podcast, we've had, for example, Ariel Selesnikov, and he very much just argues that if you have your memories, you're gonna feel like the same person, or like that's his case for digital longevity, basically. Mm-hmm. If you think about, like, to you, what would be the most exciting future with uploading? And what do you think that maybe we would need to get right now as a society to make that happen, basically?
Well, right. I mean, there's lots of things to think about. I mean, one persistent question that, Pantheon actually deals with this a little bit, but this is a question that I often see neglected, which is, if you do have uploading, you still have to have the hardware, material hardware for doing that computation of sustaining consciousness. How do you maintain that? The great thing about uploading is it creates a post-scarcity world, supposedly, right? But the post-scarcity world of uploaded minds is still built on this very material, very much constrained hardware of the real world. Like, you have to have computing centers, you have to have these, maintain that thing and sustain it and give it energy and all the rest of it. How is that going to be done? So I feel like we should think about that, right? I mean, Pantheon gave a certain answer, but we need to think about practically how you do that. Practically, how do we manage this interface between the quote-unquote physical or real world and the uploaded world? We have to figure out a way to politically mediate power between the two, since one is entirely dependent on the other, and how to collectively figure out the most equitable way of dividing benefits between the uploaded and the staying behind, right? We got to figure that out, and I don't think we actually have figured that out. And if uploading were possible, I don't think it will be the sort of thing that will be universally applied. There will be plenty of people who would say, absolutely not, I don't want to do that. So again, you have to figure out, how do you allocate power between the two? How do you allow that kind of relationship to actually develop and to sustain themselves? So these are some of the questions that we have to think about. In terms of actually making uploading work, I don't have great suggestions ahead of time, because again, this is one of those things where until you go through it, you don't know what the difficulties are. I can sit here and imagine all kinds of dystopian scenarios, but the reality is we just don't know. Historically, when major changes have happened, lots of horrible things that could have happened did not happen, and lots of horrible things that no one ever imagined would happen did happen. So my point is, futurism, in the sense of predicting what's going to happen, is a loser's game. We just have to be prepared to handle things as they come. And we're going to have to do the best we can and muddle through it because there's no other way.
I think a really interesting question in relation to the who gets to upload and who doesn't is it could be an extremely engaging, not a lot of suffering type of existence, it seems like, in a best case scenario. And so wouldn't we want to give that to other conscious beings as well, for example, like animals or something like that? Is that something that you've thought about?
Yes. In fact, if you think about it, actually, we have some evidence that that is, in fact, what people do. I mean, there are some companies that are starting to, quote unquote, sell places for being preserved in preparation for future uploading. And one pattern that comes out is that people often do this for their loved ones, not necessarily for themselves. We often think about preserving others ahead of ourselves, which is kind of lovely if you think about it, that we humans, even in something like this, can be actually thinking about others before ourselves. And I am hopeful that if we fundamentally think, right, uploading, if it were possible, has the potential to revolutionize the consumption culture that we have and to drastically reduce the amount of resources that we will require. One of the things that's missing from this modern discussion about the computational requirements and the energy needs of AI is that the amount of energy required by running these computing centers is vastly dwarfed by almost any kind of physical construction. The production of concrete, the transportation of building materials, the actual physical thing of building things is always more polluting and vastly worse than any kind of computation thing that we can do. I think that sometimes gets lost, and people think that data centers are such a terrible thing when, almost anything else we built that deals with physicality is far worse. So one of the great hopeful things I have is that, uploading will ultimately lead to a world in which our demands on the environment and our claims on the environment are less, and we can hopefully give this kind of gift to other consciousnesses, or even give space to other creatures that we now take, and minimize the amount of exploitation and enslavement we have to do for other creatures. The modern world requires the suffering of countless creatures, just factory farming of chickens and pigs. It's horrifying if you look into it even a little bit. And the reason why so many of us avoid looking into it is because we know how horrifying it is. And I'm hopeful that, one of the great consequences of uploading on a mass scale would be perhaps making it entirely unnecessary to maintain such horrific infrastructure for the exploitation of other creatures.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for diving into that. A bit of a jump in topics before we round off is you famously translated The Free Body Problem, which must be one of the most influential sci-fi books in the last decade at least. But I feel like there's some interesting things to consider there. It was famously a really a very well-made translation as well, and there's a lot of cultural translation that was needed, as I understand it. And from reading it, I know all the footnotes that were very helpful in that. I just didn't understand the cultural context of China, basically. What was it like working on that translation, and what did you want to make sure to bring to English-speaking readers when translating it, and also the US-China dynamics, or do you see translation itself as a form of world building, or how do you carry a specific world across to a different culture, basically?
So, in terms of translation, I think one of the things that people sometimes don't really understand is that translations are not really isolated practices. They occur in a context. So when you're doing a translation and when you're reading a translation, you're reading and doing the translation in the context of the larger cultural understanding. So a very simple example might be if you're reading a translation from Japanese, say done 80 years ago, the translator would certainly not maintain all the honorifics in Japanese. They would translate things into, Mr. Miyamoto, or, very honorable Mr. Miyamoto, or something like that, to give the reader a sense of what, the suffixes like san or kun and sama, what these things really mean. A modern translation done from Japanese will not do that. They will preserve these honorifics because readers reading Japanese translation now and translators doing translation from Japanese now can take it for granted that the audience will have some understanding of these aspects of Japanese culture, and therefore there's no need to quote unquote translate. This is a very simple example, but it's important because it explains why some readers don't understand what it is they're really reading. Reading a translation from, say, French or Greek is very different from reading a translation from, say, Japanese or Chinese, because most modern Anglophone audiences, or even I would say European audiences, share the same set of references when it comes to Greek mythology, when it comes to Christian theology, when it comes to contemporary, or what I would say modern European history, or the Roman Empire or something like that. But they don't necessarily share the same context of East Asian history or East Asian mythology or East Asian ideas. So the reason why translations from French or Greek might read quote unquote easier is simply because modern audiences don't even understand the degree to which things can be assumed when they cannot be assumed when you're translating from a language or a culture that is not as well understood as part of the audience's culture. So the point is, that's probably the biggest challenge when you're doing a translation from something like Chinese, because you have to figure out how many things you have to explain and how many things you simply can't explain. I mean, think about how many references are in there in an average book English every day, right? I mean, you read a contemporary novel and it will make a reference to the US Senate. It will make a reference to Apollo. It will make a reference to the Westphalian concept of the nation state. It will make a reference to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, the Parliament. All of these things are things we understand and therefore don't need to be explained. But imagine you have to translate this to a culture that has none of those things and does not understand any of those things. You would have to explain every single one of them. It would not be possible. So a proper quote-unquote translation of something like the three-body problem would have to explain every sentence, because every sentence has embedded within it references like that, which of course I did not do. So as a translator, I said, I simply cannot explain everything. I'm just going to have to explain the 1% of things that I think I can explain and not stop the story entirely. And then I would just have to let the rest go. So that's a big part of it. That's a big part of the challenge of translation, I would say. Simply that culturally, we don't understand how much of our culture is not universal. Until you do a translation from a culture that is very different from yours, or if you're bicultural, you don't understand just how great the distance between these references are. So that's one. The other thing I want to say is, the reason the three-body problem is so interesting to people is because it's mythological sci-fi. It's, again, sci-fi that is very self-conscious about its status as mythology and its own status as mythology. And to the extent readers are interested in it, that's what they're really latching onto. When I was translating from the book, the thing that I care about above all was to preserve the author's intent. And I want to be very careful here, because preserving the author's intent is not the same as preserving the author's words, because in translation, you never preserve the words. The words can be misunderstood, reinterpreted, and given any number of understandings. But what matters the most is the author's intent. So if the author intended a certain thing, then you need to represent it that way. So to give you a very simple example, let's say that, we're translating from Shakespeare or Milton, and Milton uses the singular masculine pronoun all the time. Mankind is this, and he does this, and he does that. Okay, so let's imagine we're translating this to another language. Do we use the singular masculine pronoun, or do we use he or she, or do we use they in the modern world? Well, some people would say, well, the word is he, so you should use he. Well, no, that's not that simple. What was Milton's intent? If you could interview Milton, you ask him, did you mean only to refer to male humans? Did you mean to exclude all women and all non-binary individuals? Milton might answer by saying, what kind of question is that? Get out of me. Get out of here, because that's not even a question I want to answer. Or he might be in a charitable mood and answer and say, no, of course not. Grammatically, the singular masculine embraces the feminine and the neuter, so I obviously meant everybody. Well, then a proper translation in that case would not use he. The proper translation would use they or something like that to properly give that flavor. I use that example specifically to show that there's a difference between being true to the author's intent versus being true to the word on the page. And I was always much more conscious about the author's intent than the words on the page. So yeah, that's probably all I wanted to say really on that point.
Yeah, yeah. That's very interesting. And when you say it, very obvious also about the translations are made in a context. As someone who, might have insight into both Chinese culture and like US Western culture, do you have any takes on if you think there are differences in views on technology and maybe in particular AI as it's, very much coming right now?
If there are, they're going to be at the level of mythological differences, and they're going to be at the level of very nuanced individual difference. So to give you an example of why this is a difficult question to answer in a generic way. So, some people might come up with the idea that there's a difference between Chinese culture and Western culture in the sense of strong individualism in the West and collectivism in Chinese culture. But if you actually examine this is fractally untrue, right? There are large parts of U.S. culture that are deeply collectivist. For example, the U.S. is one of the most religious nations in the world. Organized religions are deeply collectivist. There are any number of deep religious movements in the U.S. that are about subsuming individual identity within a collective identity. And there are persistent calls within U.S. culture to assume a collectivist view of things versus individualist view. And if you look at modern Chinese culture, many, many people will have told you that the modern Chinese seem like one of the most individualistic people in the entire world themselves and individuals, and not about the collective. And then if you look deeper, you can say, well, even those stereotypes are wrong because within each religious movement, you can also find individualistic pieces. And within the individualism of the modern average Chinese city dweller is a deep sense of collectivism. And you can go deeper there. So my point is that these generalizations are sort of meaningless because you kind of have to dig very deeply into the nuanced specificity of how these attitudes are actually manifested. And it's not useful to speak about generics. So do I think there are deep differences culturally in the attitudes towards things like AI or technology? Yes, I do. Can I summarize them in a simple way? Nope, I cannot. I think you have to dream in both of them to figure out the differences.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to try that. I don't know how. So I think we don't have that much time left. And you've been quite a special guest in that most of the guests that I have on the podcast are technologists and scientists, and they work on science and technology and like developing the tools themselves. How, as a sci-fi author, how do you follow? Like, how do you stay up to date? Like, where do you get your information?
This is one of my favorite things to do, read new papers and talking to scientists. I'm very lucky in that as a full-time writer, I have a somewhat flexible schedule in the way that I get to set my own hours and I get to work on things when I want to work on them. So that means I have the flexibility of attending conferences or going to conferences where scientists and philosophers are presenting and talking about and discussing their research. And it's incredibly stimulating to me to talk to them and to understand what they're doing, to read their papers and to follow up. And I'm also very lucky in that, because I had a history as a technologist, I still are in contact with technologists today, and I can go visit startups and I go talk to people who are building things, and I see what they're doing and I think about the implications of what they're doing. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm not a journalist, knowing all this stuff just helps me to dream. I don't report on them. My work is not reportage. I don't particularly care about, I'm not here to present their information to the public because that's not my job. But I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to learn from them and then to dream with the aid of this knowledge so that I can find the symbols that are potent in light of this information. So I feel very, very blessed that I've been able to know so many great scientists and to benefit from their wisdom so that I can dream in more interesting ways.
And if you think of other people who may want to start writing sci-fi or in general want to create something in this realm, do you have any advice or like any lessons learned that you found interesting along the way?
I would just say that if you have a love of making stories and dreaming, the most important thing I can think that you should do is to read a lot and read very widely. Obviously, read a lot of sci-fi because that's the genre you intend to write in, but also read lots of things that are not sci-fi at all. Read very old books, the classics, so that you know what has persisted and survived in our society over millennia. Very new books in very different genre from your own. Read romances, read contemporary novels, read literary novels, and read lots of science papers. The more widely you're exposed to facets of human thought, the better it is, I think, you can dream. Artists are not cameras. We're not there to record reality. But we do need to absorb a lot of reality in order to dream. So that's my advice. Read a lot and in widely different genres.
Interesting. I so just to round off, I want to know about your like the future that you personally find most hopeful, or at least one of them. I understand that there can be many potential futures. And there's one thing that I haven't really been able to stop thinking about that we talked about earlier in this conversation, which is, when I asked like, how can sci-fi be at its best, or like when is sci-fi at its most impactful? And you said that it's when it creates mythology, basically. But then there's like mythology that has more or less of a positive impact, basically. I couldn't, because there's I was listening to an interview with tech CEO that has a weapons company, basically. And he said that he gets his best ideas from sci-fi. And to me, that was like a depressing thing to take away from sci-fi. Because to me, it's like, well, there's like so many amazing things that could make the world so much better for so many creatures in sci-fi. But that's what you come away with. And so, yeah, how do you think that sci-fi could inspire better future trajectories, basically?
I think absolutely that there's a moral dimension to all art. I don't actually agree with the idea that artists are somehow amoral. I think that's nonsense. Artists are human beings and we are moral beings. And when we create art, we obviously do so within a moral context and with a moral purpose and so on and so forth. When you create good art, that's mythological, you also lose control of it. I think that's something that's very important for people to understand. Great myths don't belong to any individual. They belong to humans as a whole. That's just the way it is. When you create mythology, you lose control of it. So let's take a very concrete piece of mythology, the Bible, the messages of Jesus Christ. There are plenty of people who have read the New Testament and came up with the idea that the message here is one of peace, of universal love, of trying to be the best version of ourselves that we can. And there are also plenty of people who read the Bible, the New Testament in particular, and came up with the idea that the message here is about I come not in peace, but with the sword, and that we are here to fight. We're here to induce conflict. We're here to conquer. Both are quote unquote true. You can go ask Jesus, perhaps, which interpretation is better, but I don't think it will make any difference. People are going to read mythology and come away with their own interpretation. As I said earlier, people are going to read into something who they already are. So if you read sci-fi and get inspiration for ways to do surveillance and to figure out ways to kill people, that's on you. I don't think that's on the writer of the sci-fi. So that's kind of how I put it. My job is to create mythologies. What people do with it is on them. And I think we can only do the best we can to put out the most true mythology that we can, the version that is truest to the vision we had in the collective unconscious. But I don't think sci-fi writers should be propagandists. I don't think we should go out there and try to write message. Again, if I have a message, I would write the message. The reason I write fiction is because I cannot say in words what I wanted to say in words.
Yeah. No, I don't mean that sci-fi authors are responsible for writing about the weapons either. I meant it more as like there's something interesting to be explored in putting out positive mythology, which I guess is the
I
existential.
absolutely understand your point. I understand your point. And then I think to me it's that you have to put yourself into it. You have to
Yeah.
really go into the collective unconscious and be very brave, because it's a scary place. You have to be very brave, face what you find there and bring it back, and then try to portray it as truly as you can, knowing that you will never be able to get it right. I actually have a story about this. It's called The Passing of the Dragon, which is very much about what the role of an artist is, and it's going to be the lead story in my next collection. But I think a lot about this concept, which is, artists are people who are trying to portray the dragon to other people who have never seen a dragon. Your job is to portray the dragon as best as you can, knowing that it is not possible to actually ever capture the dragon for them to see. You just have to do your best. And then that's the moral dimension of it. You do your best to be true to your duty is to the truth, not to anything else, to the truth. You present that true piece of art and then let other humans read themselves into it.
True. Absolute last question. What is one vision that you find inspiring for the future?
Wow, what a beautiful and difficult question. I think a lot about, so I'm an artist, so the vision that I have here is very much focused on artists. This is a moment in which a lot of artists are terrified about the nature of generative AI and what's going to happen to them. Are we going to be replaced by machines? Will the future of art just be AI slop replacing human craft? So the one hopeful vision I have is, no, that is not the future. I think humans will always be interested in human art. And if machines actually come to make great art, it's because machines have acquired consciousness and become great artists themselves. And you can have human artists as well as AI artists. But the vision that I really have for the future is one where human artists learn to use AI as just another tool to create wonderful things that humans cannot create without that tool. And the analogy here I use is the camera, right? The camera was an invention that threatened a lot of visual artists, and it was terrifying for a lot of visual artists at the moment. But then artists very soon learned to use it as a tool. Not only is photography today its own independent fine art form, but we have cinema, which is a dramatic way of telling stories that's not possible without the camera. The camera challenged the Aristotelian unities in the dramatic arts and allowed us to invent the language of cinema, in which there is no unity of action, of place, of time. And we've all learned to read the language of cinema. Great filmmakers cannot do what they do without this machine. And we are now culturally a video culture. By far the most potent form of media and culture production is video, being all its forms. So I have hope that AI will be something like it. AI will be like the camera, just as I mentioned earlier. AI is a thought-capturing camera. And perhaps human artists will learn to make new forms of art that are not possible without it. And we will live in the future in which our artistic experience will be richer and more beautiful than ever before as a result of human artists learning to use AI as a new media. That's my vision.
That's a beautiful vision to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Ken. It was, I think, a really wide-ranging and very interesting conversation. And I, again, highly recommend your new book, and we will link it from the episode as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Beatrice. That was a really wonderful talk. Thank you.